Hello, welcome to this third installment of our deeper study on the book of Revelation. Today we're looking at the third church of Revelation, the church at Pergamum. And to give you some background information on Pergamum, we know that the name itself means stronghold because of the location of Pergamum. The city was built high on top of a mountain, and so it was very easily defended against attacks. It was very difficult for invading armies to capture this city. This city of Pergamum was also the very first place where a temple to the Caesar cult was built. We've talked previously about how people in the Roman Empire worshipped the Roman emperor, worshipped Caesar as a god. And this was the very first place where they decided to build a temple to Caesar, to hold worship services to him. Also, in Pergamum, there was an altar to Zeus that looked like a throne, and it kind of overlooked the city of Pergamum. And this is significant, this throne of an altar, because as we read here in the opening part, this opening description, this opening address to the church in Pergamum in chapter 2, verse 13 of Revelation, Jesus says, "I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells." So here we see that Pergamum is a place that's called the seat of Satan, perhaps in a reference to that throne of Zeus up above. But what is very clear, what is abundantly clear, is that the Christians here in Pergamum were surrounded by pagans that were intent on trying to get these Christians to revert back to pagan beliefs. And sometimes this pressure, sometimes this insistence turned violent, as evidenced by the execution of Antipas, by his martyrdom. And this is familiar, right? This is what the Christians in Ephesus were experiencing as well. Jesus continues in his message to the Pergamum Christians in verse 14. And he says, "But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality." Now, this is an important story from the Old Testament. Those of us that are familiar with the Old Testament, we probably remember the story of Balaam. He's found in Numbers, chapters 22 to 25. And here in these chapters, it tells a story of a prophet of God named Balaam, who was hired by the king of Moab to curse the Israelites. But he can't do it. Every time he goes out, there's multiple occasions where he goes to try to enact these cursings, but he can never get around to it because he always encounters a series of obstacles. Perhaps most famously, a talking donkey. His donkey starts to talk to him as he's on the way to curse the Israelites and starts to reason with him. Why are you doing this? And so this is an interesting story because even though Balaam never can get around to verbalizing these curses, eventually the Israelites decide to turn away from God on their own without the help of any curses from Balaam, because the Israelites start to become enamored with the beautiful, attractive Moabite women. And this is a reminder in this story that the people here, the Christians here in Pergamum, they were starting to be okay with being influenced by pagan leaders and pagan practices. Jesus continues in verses 15 and 16 and says, "Thus you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Repent, or else I will come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth." Okay, these are some pretty strong words, but we don't know really too much about who the Nicolaitans were. Some scholars think that they're probably the followers of Nicholas of Antioch. And so they were a group of Christians that were only Christians in name, that they called themselves Christians, but their actions, their words, their beliefs really did not honor or glorify Jesus or the gospel. And we see here that the church at Pergamum accepted these Nicolaitans. And if you remember in Jesus' address to the church at Ephesus, he praised them, or he had words of encouragement for them because they did not. They had turned away from this group of Nicolaitans. So whatever the details of this group was, it's very clear here in Revelation that this was not something that God wanted for his people. This was something that God clearly hated. Verse 17, Jesus says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat, and I will give him a white stone, and on that stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it." Well, there's a couple things happening here in this verse. The first is this reference to the hidden manna. And again, if you can remember some of the things that happened in the Old Testament, you'll remember that manna was the food that God sent to the Israelites 6 days a week as they wandered, as they journeyed through the wilderness. But God also told Moses to take a jar of that manna and put it inside the Ark of the Covenant, along with the 10 Commandments and Aaron's rod that had almond blossoms on it. But the Ark of the Covenant itself was placed in the most holy part of the sanctuary and then the temple. But when Solomon's temple was destroyed, the ark was secretly taken, according to tradition, was secretly taken back to Mount Sinai and hidden, and it will remain hidden there until the Messiah returns. And so what the message here in Revelation is saying is that those who overcome will be there when the ark is rediscovered. They will be there in the new earth when they will be able to partake in this heavenly bread. But also in this verse, we read about a white stone. And the scholars are, there's not quite a consensus as to what this might be referencing. There's a couple of pretty good options, though. The first is the white stone of acquittal. Back in John's day, the legal system worked a little different than it does for us here in America in 2020. But when jurors had to go to hear a case, to decide who was guilty, who was innocent, they would, along the way, pick up a white stone and a black stone. And after the cases had been made and it was time for the jury to make their decision, the jurors would go up to an urn there in a central location in the court setting, and they would place a black stone in the urn if they thought that the person was guilty, but they would place a white stone in if they thought the person was innocent. And so here, this could be an allusion to this proceeding, and Jesus saying, those who overcome, they will be found innocent in the end, at the end of time, that they will be set free. Though a second possibility is that this is referring to a white stone of admittance. When a gladiator or an athlete had been victorious, they would receive a tessera hospitalis. This was a white stone that was given to them by the nobleman who had organized the gladiatorial games or the athletic competition. And this white stone had the nobleman's name inscribed on it. And so what this white stone enabled the holder to do was to enter into the after party, enter into the feast, the celebration that took place after the games were done, after the athletic competition was completed. And so these athletes or these gladiators that had been victorious, that had overcome the competition, could come in and enjoy the feast, could enjoy a good time. And this might be Jesus saying those who overcome will be invited into the heavenly feast. They'll be welcomed into the heavenly banquet through all eternity. And more than this, it doesn't just have Jesus' name inscribed on the stone. It says it has our name, because this will be a personal invitation Jesus knows our unique qualities. He knows us individually. And so those of us that overcome will be personally invited. And so whether it's a white stone of acquittal or a white stone of admittance, it could very well be both. It could be a stone of acquittal and admittance, because Jesus promises both things are in store for those who overcome. We will be found innocent because of his blood, and will be welcomed in to the banquet because of his sacrifice. And so when we take a look now at the historicism perspective of these seven churches, we find that the church of Pergamum lines up with the third period of the Christian era, which lasted from the year 313 AD to the year 538 AD. And this period was a very significant period in the Christian era because a lot of changes happened during this time frame. It was during this era that the Christian church became the official church of the Roman Empire. And that meant that a lot of things became different because there was a combining of the gospel truth along with the previously held pagan beliefs of the Roman gods and mythology. And so we see that this pretty well reflects what was happening in Balaam's time, where there was this mingling of truth and error. But it wasn't all bad, because during this time, there were still those that were laser focused on the gospel truth, that were still very faithful to Jesus. In fact, a lot of the gospel truths were hammered out and codified during these times, during this era, through a series of very important councils. There was the Council of Nicaea, which declared that Jesus was in fact fully God. There was the Council of Constantinople, which then came and said that Jesus also was fully human. He was fully God and human. And then the Council of Chalcedon came along and declared that Jesus had both these natures. He had dual natures, that his nature was 100% God, 100% divine, and 100% human. And these were some of the shining truths that were focused on and came out of this period of Christian history. And these are truths that we still hold on to today, a couple thousand years later. And so we see that this, again, was a significant period in history where a lot of different things were happening. It was difficult, though. It was a difficult experience for the church there in Pergamum. And can you relate to this story? Can you relate to this church at all? I know I can. We look at the world around us, and while where we live, while our cities, our towns might not be called the seat of Satan, the devil is working really hard to try to confuse us about what we should believe and what we shouldn't believe. The world is constantly putting things in our path to try to distract us from the truth of God. And I don't want to be distracted. I don't want to be deceived. I want to eat some of that hidden manna. I want to receive that white stone with a new name on it. I want to overcome. And I hope you do too. God bless.